Well, good afternoon to everybody, and good morning to those on our West Coasters. We are so excited to have you here today for talking about building your chapter officer boot camp. We started this discussion back in January at Chapter Academy as our first virtual webinar, and Carrie came in and gave us a high overview of what the Central Florida's chapter officer boot camp looks like. We've got real exciting feedback about that, and thought it would be a good idea to do it as a standalone webinar, and really decided it's something that we want to do every year that gets your chapters ready for your transitioning from officers to officers each year, and even down to your committee structures at some point. So we're excited for you to be here for us to talk about that, where Carrie can go into great depth of how they put their boot camp together. A couple of things of note here, housekeeping. If you could keep yourselves on mute, we will open up conversations and can raise hands and ask questions. But just because of the volume of people, if you just could stay on mute so we don't get any background noise, I'd appreciate it. I know the question is coming, so I'm going to start with yes, we are recording, and yes, we will be sharing the slide deck, the recording, and some templates that Carrie has created as well that will go out next week's Leaders in the Loop, and it'll be in our online chapter resource guide, so you'll be able to access all of that information. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Most of you probably do know Carrie Mathis. She is our outgoing governing board chair of NIGP, but I think what she likes to be known most for, if I can speak for her, or what her passion is, has been her work within her own chapter. Carrie is very chapter centric, and I think one of the most important things for you all to think about as she's talking and to take away, Carrie has been in your shoes. She has started at the committee level, at the grassroots, at the bare bones volunteering, and then at the executive, and trying to recruit and get people to volunteer and to put events together. So she really has been in the trenches and where you are, so understands what it's like to run a chapter. So Carrie, with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to start our webinar today. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Jen, and welcome everybody. I'm so excited to be here with you today. This is just going to be kind of a follow-up to everything we talked about before Leadership Summit. So for those of you that maybe didn't have the opportunity to join then, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview when we get started before we kind of dig into, the meat of the matter. But as Jen said, I am very much, chapter is my love. Chapter has been my love for decades now. So it's really where I got started as a volunteer, and I continue to volunteer in my chapter, nearly 20 years later, because I do think that it's so important to help support those folks that are, kind of in our area, that are learning through our chapters, and certainly understanding that the chapters play such a vital role in the development of so many people in your area. So I just want to applaud you all for all of the work that you do within your respective chapters. It's incredible, and the impact that you guys are having on your local procurement professionals shouldn't be understated. It really is an amazing thing that you do to volunteer, and I'm happy to be a part of it today to just take you through this particular program, giving a deeper dive into it, thinking about conceptually how you might be able to implement something of this nature in your chapters. This session is for you, here for you. So we built in some periods of time where we're going to stop and pause for questions, but the amazing Jen Steffen is going to be monitoring chat throughout this entire session. So don't necessarily need to hold your questions until that period of time when we pause. Go ahead and start putting those in chat. It might be something that Jen can answer. It might be something that we're going to do as part of the Q&A, but it's a learning opportunity for everybody. So please participate as much as you can and ask questions. This session is for you. So we're going to start off with a poll. And Jen, if you can make an attempt to launch the poll here, we'll see what sort of answers so the question is, has your chapter developed a structured leadership onboarding strategy? And so you've got a couple options there. So we'll give you guys a moment to go ahead and and select one of the responses here so we can just get a feel for what the audience knows in terms of implementing a program of this nature or not. Let's see what we got so far. Give it another, maybe
just another couple seconds
20
here. So
seconds or
Carrie,
so.
as you can see, our least answered one so far is that formal. Very few have a very
Okay.
formal program. So I think this is
Okay.
tells us really the need for this type of session today. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll.
Okay.
So you can see our results there. So a lot of people know or haven't considered, but like the concept. So that's really, or this kind of informal, which I think, Carrie, is going to be an easier transition for some chapters that maybe have something in place already, but then just taking it to the next level.
Yes, perfect. So that's really great. And for those of you that are in kind of that 60% that either haven't done it or might be interested in it, let's just kind of focus on these details and please feel free to ask any questions that you have throughout the session as we go in. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview for those of you that maybe didn't have the opportunity to attend when we did this before Leadership Summit. Really, I'm going to be talking about 3 E's throughout this presentation, and the first one is empathy. I'll tell you that the Officer Bootcamp really is an exercise in empathy, and it's thinking about putting ourselves in the shoes of those folks that are stepping into the officer realm for a chapter. You could all think back to the period of time when you became a chapter officer, right? And did you feel lost? Did you feel disconnected? Did you feel like you had the resources available? Did you feel like you had a support system and a mentoring? Like think of all those things that you were feeling when you first stepped into the role. And what we tried to do in Officer Bootcamp is to really harness the opportunity to have a structured leadership onboarding strategy, something that was going to provide the essential Q&As for the folks, safe spaces to learn and have dialogue about things, making sure that they understood and had access to all of the resources that they're going to need to effectively manage as a chapter officer. I think sometimes we take for granted maybe that people, have previous leadership experience in these types of volunteer opportunities, maybe assuming that they might have prior insight into what governance is, what are the governance models and what is it I need to know. And so we wanted to kind of just avoid any assumptions and start a program that really was intended to provide that empathy, provide that level of support right from the onset. So I think it sets a really great tone for a chapter year to be able to come in and say, let's have this meeting, let's have this opportunity to engage in really a deeper dive into the governance, into the protocols, the roles, and have open-ended questions and just have a good dialogue to make sure that everybody is on the same page going forward. So this is all, again, about a lesson in empathy to make sure that we're properly supporting our future officers for success. So some of the benefits of doing a program of this nature are that it really is demonstrating that it's an investment in your chapter's leadership. And we're going to get into financials. We're going to talk about budgeting. When I say investment, I really mean kind of an investment in time, an investment of effort. Financially, it can be very low cost to no cost, depending on how you want to structure it. But this is really being intentional and taking the time to invest in setting them up for success. And the second E that I talked about empathy. I'm also going to talk about expectations as establishing the expectations for the leadership role. And that's important because we want to avoid any officer feeling that they're not equipped to serve in the capacity as chapter officer. We certainly might have during the nomination process a document that might identify the roles, the responsibilities for that particular officer, and you can read those and say, okay, I understand what those are. But does that necessarily equate to them being equipped and fully understanding the expectations? Who do they reach out to if they have a question about the role? How do you foster teamwork amongst those particular officers, particularly for the chapters? Many of you out there might be chapters that don't have a line of succession from, let's say, secretary to treasurer to vice president to president, a multi-year commitment going up through those officer chairs. If you have folks that are just coming in, let's say, hey, I want to be the treasurer or I want to be the vice president. That synergy amongst the officers is something that really should be kind of cultivated. And so opportunities like this to have a coming together and have meaningful discussions, I think really helps to make sure that everybody has the foundational understanding of the expectations, not only for themselves, but for the respective officers that they're serving with, and also that opportunity to engage in that dialogue and make sure that they have the resources available to them to help guide them through the term. So again, it's more about the team building, making sure that everybody has the opportunity to learn and avoid any assumptions we have. I can tell you when I came into my chapter officer role, I came in as vice president because we didn't have that structured line of succession through those roles. And I came in to serve as chapter vice president, and I really didn't know anything about governance, about running a chapter, what it meant to support the membership, how can I be effective as a leader? What are the things that I am in charge of? What are the things that I need to execute on? And so I think there's many of us that probably could say when we dipped our toe in, it's different than serving on a committee is different than hopping into a chapter officer role. And so I think this is intended to really help support that and to avoid any assumptions of what somebody does or doesn't know about governance, because it's different than serving on a committee. There's a lot more responsibility, and there's a lot of things to make sure that you're attending to. And creating that space safe for the dialogue, I think that goes a long way for teamwork. But there's no dumb questions, right? We tell that to our team members, in our own staff, there's no dumb questions. When you're onboarding somebody, we say, please ask as many questions as possible because we want to make sure that you have a good understanding. So no dumb questions, everybody jump in and help lend them support that. So this event is really intended to foster that rich discussion. It benefits all of the officers, regardless of how long they've been in the chapter leadership role. I think there's always an opportunity for us to learn every single day. I raise my hand and tell you that I learn every single day still. So there's always an opportunity to learn. And that we were all new to chapter leadership at some point. So we need to kind of extend that empathy and grace to those that are coming up and support them in a meaningful way. And so really, that's kind of the impetus of why our chapter implemented the Officer Bootcamp is really to provide that support and structure. So when we think about the program, it's all about nurturing cohesiveness. There's a lot, as you know, that goes into being a chapter officer, regardless of the size of your chapter. If it's a small chapter, medium, large, extra large, there's unique components to each of your chapters. And so how you nurture the cohesiveness of your officers really doesn't necessarily need to be unique based on your chapter size. These are kind of foundational things that we want to make sure are established regardless of your chapter. And so establishing expectation for the leadership journey, ensuring the proper support is all kind of tied into these 5 tenets that you see on the screen here. So providing the comprehensive orientation, making sure we have clear communication channels. And I've experienced this in the past where we have chapter officers that they don't necessarily utilize the communication channels that are available to them. There's one-off sometimes or fragmentation amongst the officers. And so I think it's important to create that cohesiveness from the onset and allow those folks to start developing themselves as a team, feeling comfortable with each other, kind of partnering and making sure that we have a clear channel of communication so that all of the officers remain informed about all of the decision-making, topics that come up and all of the requirements. Where Jen and I are going to talk about some requirements that chapter leaders have to contend with going forward. And so making sure that everybody has foundational knowledge of everything is important to being able to be successful. And we're going to talk a lot about resource accessibility. The resources are going to differ from chapter to chapter. And so we're going to talk a lot about kind of identifying relevant documents, but having the accessibility to those resources is also a really critical element to the success of your officers. We don't want people to have to go fish or say, oh, ask the outcoming officer, I think they have it in a file somewhere. Like, we want to make sure that we are having central repositories, easy access to all of the documents, so that there's even the legacy documents, so that they're easily accessible and can be utilized by your officers. And I think one of the important things is also to think about the support network and the mentorship. I'd love to hear from you guys in chat if you have this for your officers. If you have an outgoing officer let's just say it's the treasurer. I'm picking on the treasurer today. If your outgoing treasurer is terming out, is there a responsibility that you have formalized somewhere in your documents that they mentor the incoming treasurer or any respective seat, right? Is the outgoing officer for that position required to help mentor the person that's incoming into that position? And that's something that we have formalized in our officer documents. So if there's not that level of mentoring that's codified in some of your documents, that may be something to consider. But if you do or don't have that, it's important to establish an ability to mentor and support the incoming person. And also role-specific training. So we're gonna talk about staying in your lane. Sometimes that's easier said than done for some people when you're transitioning into another role, but it's important to kind of stay focused on the new role that you're assuming as an officer, and empowering. There's my third E. Talked about empathy, expectations, and we're going to talk about empowering. It's important to empower the person that's coming into that position to take on that role and execute it, right? And so we don't want to kind of keep our toe dipped in somewhere. We need to take it out and focus on the area that we're actually going to be in charge of executing on ourselves. So those are the three things that really we're going to kind of talk about, is the empathy, expectation, and empowering when it comes to these different positions, and skill building. I'll tell you that one of my past officers, she actually served as vice president when I was president. She specifically targeted the vice president role because she wanted to build her skill in public speaking. It was just an area that she hadn't been really well versed on, and she wanted to kind of challenge herself. And so she said, I'm going to step into that vice president role. I want to support my chapter, but I also want to build that skill of public speaking, because she knew that by virtue of holding that role, it would put her out in front and she'd have speaking opportunities. And I'll tell you that she served in that role for 2 years, and she really did develop that skill. Like, you could tell as the year went on, as the second year went on, she was much more comfortable to get up in front of people, much more easily to articulate, you know, her thoughts and those type of things. So skill building in serving as a chapter officer role is absolutely something that can be accomplished. And I think that it's a desirable thing to kind of look at, you know, where are the areas that I want to build my skills? How might this help me? And who might help me build those skills? And leadership in general is something that we always are learning about, regardless of what level you're at, and again, what size chapter. You're in a leadership role, and so that's developing your leadership skills that are going to help you as a procurement professional back in your organizations as well. So I'm going to pause before we get into how do I start, and see, Jen, if there's any questions, any comments, any thoughts about just the general overview that I've given before we actually get into the meat of the matter.
Nope, nothing yet. I think everybody is waiting for the meat, Carrie.
All right. So this is where the rubber hits the road, right? Like, where do I get started? This all sounds great in theory, you know, understand that some chapters have been doing this, but how would I start? How would I start regardless of what size chapter? So before we get into the hows, I want to again just reemphasize that this program is scalable, right? That's important to keep in mind. So don't get intimidated. Don't feel, you know, like this is too overwhelming for you. We've created a good template here for you to use, and some things really for you to think through before you even decide to start implementing it. But regardless of the size of your chapter, this absolutely is something that you can do. I will be honest and tell you that much like applying for any sort of chapter seal, any sort of, you know, agency award, the first time is always a bigger lift, you know, and that's just the truth of the matter, right? It takes some structure to get these things in place. You don't have to do it alone, and we're going to kind of talk about the resources and kind of the opportunity to build a team to pull this together. And then it's kind of a matter of maintaining through future years or future cycles that you would choose to do this. So the first time it is going to be a bit of a lift for you to kind of pull together and identify the things that we're going to talk about today. But just keep in mind that it's scalable, and keep in mind that if you guys kind of pull together and have several of you working together on this as a team, it's absolutely accomplishable. And I think you'd be pleasantly surprised at what you can pull together and be able to have an effective program. And so regardless of the size or even your financial capacity of your chapter, this is achievable. And as we go through, we're going to talk more about kind of that financial piece. So don't be scared by the cost either, because you can do it for little to no cost. All right, so we're gonna get into the things you need to consider today, the things that you need to start kind of considering if you're saying, well, this sounds really great. I think we need to kind of think of a program of this nature. So we're going to start with the event budget. And so the most that we ever spent in our chapter on a boot camp was less than $400. That included things like breakfast and lunch. It included the things like the cost of themed products. We had ordered shirts that were themed. We had bags, we had flash drives, and we had a binder that we put together here, binder material. So all of those things putting together was a cost of less than $400. And some of those things aren't necessary. So we started boot camp back in 2016, and you know, back in those days, there was a lot less that was electronic. We were much more paper centric than we are now. And so you can avoid a lot of those costs, or most of those costs. You don't necessarily have to have, you know, promotional products to promote the event. You don't necessarily have to have meals. You don't even necessarily need to put together a hard copy binder, a tangible binder. You can provide all of that stuff electronically and really cut down on your costs. So, but just to give you perspective in terms of a chapter that's done, you know, things to really kind of promote it a lot, less than $400 is all we've ever spent on this event. And we do a full day of training. So that'll give you some perspective. But as we work through the session, I'm going to identify some cost factors and some strategies to consider for you to even minimize that event, those costs even more. But this is really a perfect time of year for you to start considering some of these factors right here. So talked about the event budget. We're going to talk about thinking about if the event attendance will be a mandatory requirement that's embedded in each officer's position description. So I'm going to stop there for a minute and let you kind of think about that, because I think one question.
I don't even know what to do.
I think somebody's not on mute. One question to think about is, do you even have position descriptions for your officers? And if the answer is yes, what is the expectation for those position descriptions? If you're implementing something of this nature, do you want to make it mandatory for them to attend this particular event? And so I'll tell you that I've talked to a couple chapters over the year about this concept of boot camp, and some of the things that they've shared with me is that they struggled to be able to implement it because they couldn't get the officers to actually commit to attending. Right. And so that told me that they didn't make the attendance requirement mandatory. It likely was probably something that came about probably like after their nomination cycle, but they never were able to implement it, at least in that cycle, because they couldn't get the buy-in from the officers. And so thinking about the timing of when you want to convey that expectation might be the summer. It might be before your nomination process starts. Because if you do want to instill that commitment of attending, then now is the time that you need to think about maybe updating or creating some of those position-specific descriptions and including that as a requirement. I'll pick on the people in Florida because I'm one of them, but most of the times in our job duties for our procurement job postings, we say that you will be required to actually perform your job function at the Emergency Operations Center if we're activated, right? So we put that expectation in the job description to say you will have to participate in this. And so I liken this particular opportunity for attending boot camp to that particular language in a job description. If this is something that you feel strongly about, that you want your officers to make sure that they're attending, put it in the responsibilities in that job description so they're aware of that even before they decide to submit a nomination. And so that leads into the next thing. When is the appropriate time to even think about marketing this? You really need to kind of plan ahead of time, particularly if you're going to make it mandatory for attendance. I would recommend then that you start marketing this perhaps prior to your nominations, or at least while you're accepting nominations, to really focus on making sure that they're aware of this opportunity while they're being nominated or while they're nominating themselves. Again, if you wait post-election, you might not necessarily have the buy-in. And at that point in time, you say, well, we really, you know, you're required to attend. They might say, you know what, that wasn't in the description when I signed up for this, and I'm not attending. And that's happened. Like, I'm sharing that with you because it's happened. So just think about the timing. And again, the summer cycle is a great time for you to start really kind of factoring that in if you need to update documents or convey that requirement before nomination. Think about how you'll deliver the event. Several of you said that you kind of have an informal thing going on, which is great. At least it's something, right? For those of you that want to have this event that maybe haven't already, think about how you're going to deliver it. Will it be required to be in person? Could it be virtual, or a hybrid where some might be in person and some might be virtual? And I got two schools of thought on that. I'll share with you. Over the years, we've actually held it in person, and I think it's been intentional that way because you get all those folks in the same room, and when you think about team building, that's the most ideal opportunity to build a team, a cohesive team, and engage in those team building exercises when they're face to face. It can be more of a challenge if you have some folks that are virtual. The last cycle that we did, we had one person virtual just because they were dealing with some health issues, and there was no way that they could be able to travel in and kind of participate in that. So we didn't want them to miss out on the opportunity. We did make an adjustment to allow for that person to attend virtually. But by their own kind of post-event remarks, they said, you know what, I really wish I would have been there in person because I felt a little disconnected not being there in person and being able to engage in that face-to-face discussion. So again, just something to think about in terms of the logistics. I know a lot of chapters, you might be statewide chapters, you might have large geographic areas that your chapter membership covers. And so it just might not be feasible for you to get together in person to do this. So at least having a virtual or hybrid option is better than nothing at all, right? And so that really is something for you guys to consider in terms of the structure and thinking about what's your expectation for coming out of boot camp. Is it to inform and educate and set expectations and have discussion? Might the team building component be able to be facilitated elsewhere, maybe after a chapter meeting or something? So if that's the case, or if your priority is really kind of setting that foundational understanding, and the team building, would be a nicety but not necessary since we're so geographically spread out, that's okay too. These are just things for you guys to consider because they've been things that have been challenges before for either ourselves or from what I've heard from other chapters that have tried to implement. And think of the timing and duration of the event. This is another key area that has been a challenge for some chapters. Do you consider holding it during the week? If so, is it during the week that people might have to take time out of their work schedule? Do you do it in the evening? Do you do it on a weekend? Some people don't want to give up their weekend time to do something of this nature. And again, I've heard from some chapters saying, I couldn't get people to commit half a day on a Saturday. I couldn't get people to commit 2 hours on a Saturday. The weekends are off. And so I think this one probably goes back to that expectation setting in the position description. And I guess my philosophy, I might be a little old school on this, but like it's one day out of 365 days, right? Like it's one weekend day out of 52 weeks that somebody is taking the time to invest in your success, right? And this is how we kind of convey it to our incoming officers. We're investing in your success. Our expectation is that you are going to come spend a Saturday with us so that we can go through everything to make sure that you're set up for success for your 2-year officer term, right? So, but it's a challenge. I get it. I don't know that we have the secret sauce. We've conveyed the expectation up front. We can't do it on a weekday because it's just too challenging in terms of scheduling. I've heard some chapters say that they do it kind of post-chapter meeting, like if they have a chapter meeting on a Friday and it's from 12 to 2, and then they spend the next 3 hours, going through a boot camp. That's okay too. Whatever works. I know some of your chapters have conferences too, so maybe post-conference. It really depends on the timing. Ideally, I would recommend if you do a boot camp, it's at the beginning of your calendar year, the beginning of your term of officers, to the extent practical that you can. And so think about that in terms of the timing of your cycle of conferences or your cycle of board meetings. And then think about how long you might need people to dedicate in terms of time. For those of you that haven't done it before, and it might depend on the size of your chapter or how much detail you want to go in, you might be able to looks like my computer froze up. Can you guys still hear me okay?
Yep, we can hear you.
Yes.
Keep going. You're
I
good.
can hear you. Okay. All right. So I'm going to reboot my computer real quick because my computer froze up. So we're going to be stuck on the screen here for a minute so I can get logged back in. I apologize. But lucky for me, I printed out my slides in case I did get stuck, because this happens from time to time, and I'm going to reboot. But we're going to kind of keep on this topic of how long do you actually need to kind of think about, and you're not going to know the answer to that just yet, because we've got to get into more of the details of how you're going to actually structure the program. But that's just something to think about, is all of these different factors. And I would recommend for the remainder of your officers that maybe aren't able to join today, have them listen to this recording, have them watch the recording and think about the materials, and just have a discussion with them, because some of these things you're probably going to need to flesh out amongst the team to understand structuring some of those logistical components going forward.
Carrie, and if I can also just reiterate something at this time, and
Yep.
you mentioned it at the beginning of the slide, is as leaders coming in, don't look at this as something you need to take on your own. I think it's team building to develop your first one together. Who could do a piece of finding our venue? Who can compile everything into one document for us? Who can do all the requirements that are needed for NIGP documents? Who can pull in everything that is required for maybe incorporation or state tax exemption or all of those type of things, where it's not a burden of one person taking on the ownership to create this thing. So let it start from the beginning of being a team building with the current board that you have.
Yeah, and that's a really great thing to emphasize, Jen, because again, it this doesn't need to seem overwhelming. It should not be overwhelming. If you divide and conquer, and again, this is a great time of year to even start thinking about it. Having those initial conversations about, do we want to do this? Let's think about those expectations. And if you're going to deploy a program of this in the spring, then you've got plenty of time to kind of work together as a team with your existing officers to get some of that in place and actually kind of assemble the program material. So there's the good news is for the 2025 cycle, I think most, if not all, chapters are on a calendar year, fiscal year. Is that correct, Jen?
Yeah,
Is
almost
there anybody else
on a calendar year.
Calendar year, yeah. So I mean, think now you've got what, a good 5-6 months before you even would think about deploying that. So that's a really great amount of time for you to be able to work through and get those things in place. I'm going to go ahead and try to log in again here real quick, and that's why I called in, because my computer for some reason fails me sometimes. So I apologize for this. But I'm going to go ahead and log on again.
We got a good question that Maya asked about. She asked of the group, so I'm going to ask people to respond in the chat. Does everyone run their elections to coincide with their chapter year, or do they offset those? Okay. So maybe some good questions to talk about in the chat now. Why you're getting rebooted is when do you hold your elections? Yep. What's your cycle? And I think the other thing a lot of people ask for, and you think about how often you need to do this boot camp, is how often do your leadership turnover? Do you have 2-year terms? So if people want to go in the chat and start sharing, does your election cycle coincide with the calendar year, and how long are your officer terms?
And are they staggered at all? I don't know if they staggered or not, but that might be something, because this opportunity could be for any time you have new officers coming in, even if it's just a single new officer.
Yep. And I don't recommend turning all your officers over at the same time.
Yeah.
Certainly to stagger that. Carrie, if you're having issues, I can pull up the PowerPoint and do the slides for you.
Well, it's saying that the host has joined and we've let them know you're here. So I think that's you.
Okay. Sorry.
There we go. No, that's okay. No, that's okay. Good. Thank you. Sorry about that.
So we have a lot of 2-year terms.
Okay.
It is all on the calendar. And that treasurer, and you and I talked about that before, that treasurer sometimes can be that other position that people have longer positions for. It's a hard position to get into. There's a lot of requirements for a treasurer, so it's not uncommon to see chapters offset that treasurer position and make it outside of your normal cycle. It could be a 3 or 4 year, and maybe your other officer terms are only 1 or 2, and that's not uncommon to happen.
Awesome. All right. All right, so here we go. We're back in.
You're good.
All right. Okay, so let's talk about program management. And I've really broken this down into 4 different elements, 4 distinct categories. So again, as Jen said, when you think about not necessarily having one single person, but maybe having that team building, maybe kind of separating and having different roles help to fulfill and bring some of this to fruition. This is a great separation of 4, but I would suggest to you that you still might be able to find some more bifurcation within some of them to even expand to more than just 4 people. I don't think that it hurts to have more people helping to assemble this, because the more people that you have, then the less less time it will take, and then you feel like you aren't so overwhelmed with having to at least pull this together. So we're going to talk about 4 different distinct sections of it. We're going to talk about all things logistics that you need to think about in terms of scheduling, identifying location, what technology you might need, what resources to provide a distract-free environment so that they can engage. And then we'll talk about the critical need to identify a skilled facilitator. We're going to talk about the preparation, which again would be now until the time, that your calendar year starts, your chapter year starts. Taking the time to prepare and identify what's relevant to your chapter. And then let's also talk about some post-action events that take place to make sure that you're obtaining proper feedback and making sure that you've actually met the expectations of the people that went through the boot camp, right? Because you want to make sure that you're hitting the mark, that you're meeting whatever their expectations are as well. So as we work through these, again, let's think through multiple volunteer opportunities that these can be broken down into. And we're going to start with the logistics. I think we've talked a little bit about the logistics of just even thinking through when you might want to even develop this program and market it to folks that are interested in being officers. But we've created a checklist. I created a checklist for you here to think through some of the logistics. So we're going to start with selection of a location. And again, this would contemplate that you are somewhat centralized, right? Like even if you're going to do it hybrid, and some of you might be in person, you want to think about a centralized location that's easily accessible for the folks to come into, and one that's conducive to learning and collaboration. So a location could have a cost factor involved. Consider utilizing like a centralized office space to avoid the cost. In past years, we've utilized some of our member agencies' offices, particularly because we've held it on a weekend. And so we'll book out a conference room at our office or at the airport procurement's office. Nobody's in those spaces on the weekend, right? And we have access to kind of a quiet space. The technology is there that we need if we're going to show PowerPoints and things like that. And there's no cost associated with booking out a facility of that nature. And so if you do hold your chapter meeting somewhere, maybe at a certain facility, and you have it booked out for the day, that also might be an opportunity for you to think about holding it, at that point in time to really kind of mitigate against some of the additional costs if you were to book out a meeting space at a hotel or something. So just things to think about is, could you hold it before or after a chapter meeting to make sure you're utilizing and taking advantage of space? But the location would be key to make sure that it's just something that's easily accessible and hopefully low to no cost for you. And think about the technology, and it's going to depend on if you are going to have virtual or hybrid, right? Because you might need to have that connectivity to make sure that people can access and remote in. Make sure that you have the appropriate equipment and technology to be able to support their connectivity into the event. You could structure it as a lunch and learn if you wanted to try to avoid the cost of meals or snacks. It really would depend on how long the event is scheduled for, but you could also take a break for lunch and go enjoy kind of a local, eatery that you guys go out to kind of absorb that cost if people are, willing to just go buy their own lunch and things like that. But again, when we bought breakfast and lunch, it was, maybe a couple $100 depending on, how many people you have attending. We might also want to think about expanding to potential officers. So we had a request from our strategic planning coordinator. They actually wanted to come in and observe the boot camp as well, because as the strategic planning person for the chapter, they felt like it really would be helpful for them to have some foundational knowledge about governance too. And so it's possible that you might have kind of a key person in your chapter that's not necessarily holding the title of officer. Some of you might have directors as well. I think there's different structures of chapters. So, consider if you're going to have more than your traditional, I would say 4, that might also lead you to higher costs if you're doing meals and things like that. But I would say the ROI on including those people might really be beneficial, because it gives them some of that knowledge, and they also might be, it might be a succession planning of sorts, because some of those folks really might be interested in taking that next step up to a chapter officer role. And so we're going to talk about relevant resources. We're going to talk a lot about that during this webinar. But for your logistics checklist at this point in time, this is where you're just going to want to spend time dedicating to reviewing your chapter documents for relevance and identifying any that you think should be included in the session. And we're gonna give you an opportunity to kind of think about that here in a little bit, and kind of maybe chime in on some of the documents that you would identify as perhaps relevant to your particular chapter. But right here for the logistics, just starting off early on in the planning, you're going to really want to kind of mine your documents and just work through identification, not compilation, just identification, and thinking through what are those critical documents. Think about what you would have liked to have known about. Think about what you would have liked to have access to. Again, this is back to the empathy piece. We're going to take a deeper dive into this in a little bit to think about, what those relevant documents may consist of. But at this point in time, early on, just think about who is the best resource or resources to identify which are the relevant resources that you want to include in your particular boot camp. So we're going to move on to facilitation. And the key to an effective boot camp or orientation, whatever you want to call it, really is proper facilitation. I highly recommend that you have someone that is facilitating this instead of just your 4 officers coming together to have a dialogue. I think I would recommend that it be somebody in addition to those officers that's coming in. They're going to do their own planning, but they're going to be responsible to actually facilitate the discussion. Should be somebody that possesses strong facilitation skills, to be able to make sure that they're fostering that meaningful engagement in the discussion, making sure that all have an opportunity to speak, to ask questions, to share perspectives, and to learn. And so a recommendation for a facilitator, again, no cost. You can spend money to bring in a professional facilitator, but I'm going to suggest to you that you could probably avoid that cost by thinking about engaging perhaps some of your past chapter officers to serve in the role of facilitator. Who better to have knowledge about your governance documents and the running of your chapter than somebody who has been there, done that. So they're ones that remain invested in your chapter's success. They have a good grasp on all things related to your chapter. It can truly be helpful in guiding the discussion, and they can also share their experiences in navigating the leadership role. So I think having somebody come in with that perspective really would be beneficial to facilitating the discussion. If you have past presidents, past chapter officers that are still engaged in your chapter, I would say those are probably the prime ones to reach out to, as opposed to some who maybe are a little bit removed from your chapter. Because again, if they're still committed to volunteering and serving in your chapter and giving back, this would be a great role for them, hopefully, to fulfill, and they might agree to do it for little to no cost. Maybe even if you just provide them lunch for the day, they'd be willing to step in and help facilitate that. Alternatively, you could consider bringing in a facilitator, but then you're talking about potential for cost there, which can be avoided if you have someone else come in and facilitate. And Jen, I don't know, I don't want to throw it out there. I know you guys are working through chapter ambassador things and kind of SMEs and those kind of things. So maybe at some point in time in the future, there might be an opportunity once that structure is built to have some of those folks be able to come in and help serve as facilitators. But I think that might be a step down the road a little bit. So again, for some of you who might be thinking about implementing this in the 2025 year, start thinking about who might be ripe in your membership to be able to serve as a facilitator. And one of the things that I would say is don't rely on the facilitator to be the resource gatherer, right? Because the resource gathering should be left to the folks that are really familiar with those relevant documents. So the facilitator should be involved in the planning process, only to the point in time where they have familiarity with the content that you want them to convey during the meeting and the concepts that you want to make sure are emphasized during the meeting. But just keep in mind, they have their own role to fulfill in the chapter boot camp, and that's the role of the facilitator. They certainly will be taking time to look through documents and make sure they're familiarizing themselves, but I would recommend that you keep the facilitator role to simply providing them access to the documents in advance, telling them what your expectations are for the actual meeting, and allowing them to focus on facilitating rather than gathering. So I think it's important to have that separation. And Jen, I'm going to stop here because we went through kind of two of those programmatic elements. So I'm going to stop here to see if anybody has any questions before we move on to the preparation piece.
No, at this point, we don't have any questions. So we're good to continue.
Okay, perfect. So, so we're going to focus now on the preparation piece. Preparation is key. And again, it should be divided up into multiple volunteers to help really reduce the amount of efforts that expended from any one person. But to be honest, again, this is an area that's likely going to require the most time and dedication when it comes to developing this program, at least for the first time. In other years, in years where you're just kind of maintaining and updating, that lift is going to be a lot less, right? And so if you can just kind of get through this first cycle with having your officers jump in and kind of think through standing this program up, then from then on, it's a matter of maintaining and again, having that person facilitate. And I would also recommend you think about, for those of you that are going to be going through boot camp, you know, give back in the future and maybe consider facilitating the boot camp for others that come behind you. All right, so we're going to dig into the preparation checklist. This is your second checklist to think about. One of the things to think about is establishing a strong communication plan. And this is messaging. This is to garner anticipation and avoid schedule conflicts. So this is one of the things that we talked about when you're maybe incorporating this in as a requirement to your officer duties and role is, you know, what I always tell my team is it's all about perspective. Don't say, do I have to go to a meeting? You don't have to go to a meeting, you get to go to a meeting, right? And so it's all about that perspective. So we don't want your officers saying, do I have to go to this training? You don't have to go, you get to go, you're selected. You are one of the few that get to participate in this boot camp program, and it's designed to ensure your success, right? So I think, you know, if you have strong messengers, if you have strong communicators in your chapter that can convey messages in such a way that it builds excitement, it builds anticipation, that's really what's to be desired. Not to go, oh, I have to give up 2 hours of my weekend for this or 2 hours of my workday. Like think about framing the conversation and the opportunity. This is an opportunity, right? This may be a single volunteer that you have committed to this particular task, but it really is an important one because it's kind of setting the tone. It's setting the tone to build excitement, to build anticipation, to feel included, to be part of something, right? To be part of an opportunity. And so I'm going to give you a couple examples of some communications, you know, templates that you could consider using, but this alone could be a specific volunteer opportunity outside of the whole, you know, bigger frame of the preparation component of this. Consider the expectation of the attendees. So if you yourself would be attending this, what would your expectations be? If you're the folks that are going to be putting this program and developing this together, be inquisitive and ask them to identify what specific topics they want to have included in the session, because this session is all about setting them up for success, right? And so again, think with that empathy piece. What are the things that my officers want to make sure that we're addressing in here? Reach out and ask the question. Just remember that this session is for them to have dedicated time to dig into all things governance, facilitate those in-depth conversations, engage in the question and answer, and reaffirming a commitment to supporting their success. So I think that to outreach to them really is critical to engage them early on in that planning process, so they feel that feeling of inclusion early on, and to also ensure that the session is going to meet their expectations as well as yours. Right. And so I think that's where you get some of that buy-in, is just to include them early on and say, look, we really want to make sure that this is meeting your expectations as well. What is it we can do to make sure that we're including all of the information that you're interested in hearing during this event? And now we're going to talk about the compilation of the resources, right? So we're going to pause for a minute, and in chat, I really want to encourage you guys to participate and think about this, and please share, because I think this is beneficial for everybody that's on this particular webinar. Think back to your own transition into chapter leadership. What would have been helpful for you to know? What would have been helpful for you to have access to? What are the things? If you can be introspective and think and share about what are those things, this is the key to a boot camp concept. What are the things? It's up to you to identify what are those things that are relevant to your chapter. And so put yourselves in the shoes of those people that will be attending. What are the things I think that they're going to need to know? What are the things I think that they're going to want to know? What did I want to know? What was helpful for me to know that I didn't know? Who could I ask those questions to? Like, think through all of those things, and let's hear in chat. Identify some documents you have. They could be program documents. They could be policy documents. They could be timelines. You know, what are all of those things that you would have liked to know that would have been helpful? And what have you created as a result of that? You know, have you stepped in and said, look, you know, I'm a structuralist person. I needed to develop this so that it would help me be successful in this role. So Jen, I see some things in chat. We want to maybe look through some of those and see what people are identifying.
Yep, these are good. Notes and important timelines and deadlines we talked about. It would have been nice to know what committees I needed to serve as VP. So that's those position descriptions, and knowing what you need to oversee. A strong transition organizational chart, chapter budget.
Yep.
I think I love this one. Think about the unwritten expectations.
Yep.
There's a lot of things that aren't in writing that is expected of you, of fiduciary responsibilities and speaking with one voice, and all these things that we take for granted as a leader of a nonprofit that aren't in writing. Some templates, the expectations of my position. Again, that's reevaluating what is in those position descriptions, and what does it really mean of my time and level of commitment. A bylaw review, excellent. How to develop a budget, who's who does what, who is responsible for what. Good checklists. So there's a lot of great things. Policies and procedures handbook. I also think about, again, I mentioned it, those requirements of the positions to the IRS. Do you, as an incoming chapter officer, did you know that you signed an affiliation agreement with NIGP? Do you have an agreement with a university in your area that you do work with? Things like that, a strategic plan. What have past ones look like? Have we met them? Have we exceeded them? So there's lots of things like that. But I think this position and role and timeline seems to be the overarching.
That's great. This is a lot of great information. This is a lot of great detail. I'm glad that you guys are thinking at this level, so that you're already kind of identifying, right? What are those documents? What are the things that I would have liked to know? Because this is going to be helpful for those folks that are coming behind you and being part of this. And Donna, kudos to you, because I actually am going to talk about some of those unwritten expectations, and I don't disagree with you on that, you know, it's one thing to look at a roles and responsibility document, but what are the unwritten things that I'm also responsible to know? I think that's an important thing for your folks to identify and talk about as well. So you've identified a lot of things that you wanted to know. And maybe some of these do exist, maybe some of them don't exist, which would be another good opportunity to try to start developing some of those things, right? And that may take the course over a significant amount of time to be able to get to those. But for the documents that do exist, think about where they are. Do they currently exist on your website back end? Is there a centralized repository for them, which would be ideal, or are they kind of scattered? Do you have them in Dropbox? Do I have some on my president's flash drive somewhere, you know, in my desk? Like, where are these documents housed? Think about the compilation. It could be completely electronic, accessible to all of the officers in a certain library within your chapter website. It could be assembled in a master PDF document provided to the officers on a flash drive. And that's a minimal cost, right? Flash drives are fairly cheap, but at least they'd have kind of a hard copy or electronic copy on a flash drive that they could carry over. You don't, again, have to do something like a tangible binder unless you want to have something of that nature. But all of these things are perfectly acceptable means to provide access to the relevant resources. And think also about pre-work. So that's the fourth bullet here about distribution of key documents in advance. Distribute your large or critical documents well in advance of the meeting as pre-work so that they have sufficient time to review and prepare questions regarding those. So some of those things that Jen talked about, the affiliation agreement, a strategic plan. This might be one of the first times that an officer has even had access to your strategic plan or really took the time to meaningfully review it. Bylaws, any sort of SOPs that you have, those can be fairly lengthy in size. And so to provide those in advance, give those folks an opportunity to review those, kind of digest them, maybe make notes, prepare their own questions for coming to the meeting. And so it's always recommended to provide those in advance so that they have access to those and can review those. So let's dig into the communication plan. And again, we want to think about communication starting from the onset of when the expectation is set. And that could be before your nomination time frame. It could be during your nomination time frame so that they're aware that attendance is an expectation. We don't want people to be caught by surprise, and we want them to know that this is an opportunity that's extended to them. Ideally, an event date should be identified as early on as possible so it can be communicated as far in advance as possible to avoid any sort of schedule conflicts. And there might be certain times in the early spring where you say, well, we have a conference in February, so it wouldn't be ideal for us to do it there, or maybe it would be because we're going to do it in conjunction with our conference. But just think about those times that you might have schedule conflicts. And the earlier on that you can book the date out and communicate that to your officers, the better chance you have for success in actually getting them there without a schedule conflict. And building anticipation, right? Consider messaging that emphasizes the chapter's investment in ensuring success. And then we think back to that, do I have to, do you get to? It's all about the perspective. So messaging, theming can be fun. We use the boot camp thing with like camouflage and things like that. Like we really played up the boot camp type of thing, and we had bought flash drives that looked like little dog tags. You know, but you don't have to go to that expense, but you could still theme it, right? And so I know for a lot of your conferences, you do theming. For a lot of your different reverse trade shows and different events, you do theming. So you could do theming for this as well. And that might also garner some excitement and anticipation for the folks that are going to be coming. And I'll say coming up, I'm going to share with you some templates about communication messaging, but whoever is responsible party for the communication piece, really encourage them to develop a timeline to keep those messages flowing for momentum leading up to the actual event. And so you can see here the last bullet, I just recommend at least 2 weeks before, send them the finalized event details with any of those relevant documents to review in advance. But anytime you can keep that message flowing, I think that helps to garner the excitement. So this is an example of a save the date message that you could use to market the event to your incoming officers. This is actually one that we utilized back in 2021, and it just gives kind of basic information about, you know, they're hereby invited to attend it, right? Even though in our case, it actually is a mandatory thing, but, you know, we don't want to say you're being forced to come to this or, you know, you must attend this. You're being invited. This is an opportunity, you know, that we're extending to you. We want you to come and be part of it. So we give all of the relevant information, the location, the time, who the facilitators are going to be, and then we give them a little bit of instruction to arrive 15 minutes in advance, be prepared to stay for the duration of the session, and that copies of the materials will be provided because we didn't want them to have to think about having to print anything out. We wanted to make it as easy as possible for them to come in and be participatory and not have to worry about too much prep other than any pre-work that we provided to them. And so we're establishing the expectation. We want them to be there. We want them to be engaged for the duration. And this boot camp, you can see it's pretty long. It's 8:30 to 4, and we have breaks built in there and things like that. But one of the things that we mention when we get there is we want their undivided attention, right? We're investing in the time to come in and facilitate and share all this information with them. And the expectation is that they're gonna be present for this, right? We ask people, please put your phones away, you know, unless you're expecting some sort of emergency call, we're gonna ask you to please stay focused and things like that. And I think that's all about that expectation piece again. We want them to be there and make sure that they're engaging in the conversation and the teamwork. The next message is pre-event. So this is, again, like 2 weeks leading up to the event. You know, final preparations are underway. Again, we're emphasizing the date and time that it's going to be there. We're going to ask them when to arrive and settle in. And then we give them kind of an agenda for the day. So we're going to give them breakfast. We're going to dig into some boot camp training, taking breaks. We're going to have lunch. We're going to do more training. And here's where we attach those relevant documents that we feel are relevant. So we've attached our bylaws, program documents and policies, and our strategic plan. And we ask them before coming to the training to come prepared with any questions concerning those documents, right? And that's really intentional to make sure that they have an opportunity to review them in advance, because it's going to slow down your training, right? If they're kind of skimming through it and looking through it when they get there. The expectation is they're reading this in advance and coming prepared with questions. We tell them there's no need to print copies. They're going to receive all the materials there, and that we're going to provide meals for them. And we provided a link with directions to the meeting location. So in your messaging, consider any logistical details that you want to convey to attendees. It might be those maps. It might be meal menus if you're going to order meals, provide them the menus in advance and have them make their selection. You could even just provide them electronic links to the documents. If you have a central repository that you have those in, whatever you feel is important for them to know, convey it in this messaging. And consider the timing of sending the messaging to allow them sufficient time to be able to read through those documents. So you wouldn't want to send this like 3 days before on a work day. You know, that might not be relevant enough time for them to kind of sift through large amounts of documents and be prepared. So I would say a couple weeks in advance at least. Make sure that you're conveying that expectation for reviewing the materials and giving them proper time. So let's talk some more about the relevant documents, right? You guys have done a great job in chat of thinking through, you know, what are the things I would have liked to know? What are the documents that would have been helpful or that are helpful or that we should be focusing in on? Let's stop and think about this particular area, because it truly is one of the core elements for your boot camp, is orienting your leaders to the documents that are relevant to your chapter. And so I carry this binder around with me. I took it to Chapter Academy. I've taken it before to some of the forums for people to look at. And people are always interested in knowing what's in my binder. But this isn't about what's in my binder. This is about what's in your binder. What are the things that are relevant to you? Because what's relevant to my chapter might not be relevant to your chapter. And so thinking through what is going to be relevant is truly of the utmost importance. Avoid assumptions, right? I want to make sure that we're continuing to think about avoiding assumptions of what an officer might know. Let's assume that they don't, right? Let's prepare them with the assumption that they don't know anything about your chapter governance or any of these documents. Let's assume that they're unfamiliar with any or all of those relevant documents, and that we literally are starting with square one to make sure that they are sufficiently supported. When you look over to the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a table of contents that's from one of our binders that we had. But what I'll share with you is, again, it's not important what's in our binder. It's what's important to be in your binder. But what I'll share with you is that when we started, we didn't have 12 tabs. This evolved over time. We maybe started with like 7 or 8 tabs of just kind of the critical things that were important and programmatic at the time. And so over the course of years, as our program has evolved, we have cycled some things out of the binder and we brought more things into the binder. So it's really a fluid kind of document repository that's relevant to your chapter. And when I say binder, it could be electronic. It doesn't have to be a tangible physical binder, but this kind of gives you an outline of the things that we felt were important for us to convey. Think about things like, in the past several years, your chapter executed an affiliation agreement with NIGP. The officers at the time know about the affiliation agreement. Do your new officers coming in know that there even is an affiliation agreement? Do they understand what's in the affiliation agreement and what those authorizations and limitations that chapters have to comply with specifically in that one document alone? Those are important things to talk about, to go through, to make sure they have a foundational understanding of just that one piece, just that one document. You could spend some time really working on that and making sure that they are aware of it and have access and have read that document. This is just really a great example of a document that warrants specific discussion to ensure that they have an outstanding, an understanding of those parameters. And it's also a document that your facilitator will want to have in advance to access so they can prepare as well, so they can be informed about it. So again, avoiding assumptions of oh yeah, we have an affiliation agreement. You don't necessarily know that anybody even knows what that is, or much less what it contains. So that's really a good example of kind of relevance and thinking not just about what you know, but about what people don't know.
Mary, if I can also add, I think about all of chapters programs, your sponsorship program, your scholarship program. If you're not the one that is created it and looking at the applications that come in, to me, again, it's that assumption that all of your board and leadership should know the functionality of that. And this is a great opportunity to share exactly how our sponsorship lays out for our events, or how we give out scholarships each year and how that budget ties into that. But I think that's key, is to not assume that, oh, you've been with the chapter for 10 years, you know our scholarship program. They really may not know it from the other side. And I think that's important to remember.
Absolutely. Timelines is another thing. If you have structured timelines for officer roles and say, well, these are the tasks of the vice president and these are when they're due. If you've built out a structure of a timeline, and I'll be sharing an example of one with you because we do have timeline. All of those are helpful, right? Because that's setting expectation and empowering them to be able to execute those things. Key dates. So we're going to show you an example of that here in a minute, but some of those required forms that NIGP has, they have date timelines assigned to them. You might have key dates for your conference program or your Verse trade show or some of your chapter meetings. Don't assume that those folks know what those dates are. Provide them documents to lay all those out so that they have a great foundational understanding of everything that's important to your chapter. Another thing to consider if you want to implement a program of this nature is to have an annual check-in to identify what remains relevant, what might need to be removed because it's been sunsetted, it's no longer valid for your chapter, and what should be added. So consider perhaps a volunteer resource assignment annually might be someone to monitor and assess the relevant documents, or perhaps something your officer group might want to do on an annual recurring cycle. It's really important to maintain your document structure as current so that when you're conveying all of this in future years, you have accurate information and relevant information to share. And so as your programs evolve, you'll want to make sure that this particular program evolves with it as well. So Jen, I'm going to stop and again, see if there's any questions before we move on to the presentation portion of preparing for the boot camp. Any questions?
No questions. No, because I want to make sure we have 20 minutes. So I want to make sure you can get through the rest of the slides, but no questions yet.
Okay. All right, perfect. So whomever is facilitating the boot camp may want to develop an accompanying slide deck to navigate topics. It's not necessary if the facilitation is structured in a different way, like maybe you have an outline or an agenda. The important piece really is to ensure that there's sufficient time and attention paid to all of the discussion points that are critical to convey. So again, a slide deck isn't necessary. Fine if you have one, okay if you don't have one. But I provided a few examples for topics for deep dives in terms of expectations of officers. And this is where we get into some of those other things, or I think, trying to think of what Diane's, the unwritten things, right, that were mentioned, that Donna mentioned, the unwritten expectations. We're going to kind of get into some of those. If your chapter has detailed roles and responsibilities for each officer position, I would encourage you to have nominees affirm their understanding of those roles during the nomination process. And even if you do have an affirmation as part of that nomination process, I strongly encourage you to include this as part of the dedicated time for boot camp, to have a comprehensive discussion in this area, affording opportunities for questions to be asked about each specific officer role. And if you have a true officer succession, throughout all of the positions. And this is really a great time for those who most recently filled the respective position to also weigh in and support the transition dialogue. I think that that's helpful because, again, we don't want to assume that anybody knows anything about these positions, afford them the opportunity to talk about transition. And so one of the things I talked about at the top of the session was expectations, empowering to execute, right? The expectation piece can be communicated and documented fairly simply, but empowering piece is something you're going to really want to dig into, piecing it together with the separation of duties to really emphasize the importance from transitioning from a prior role that they fulfilled to solely focusing in on their new role. And so for some, that's a hard transition to make. It's hard to give up something that you are passionate about or that you're used to doing and you feel like you're good at, and you probably are good at it, but we need to allow somebody else to have that opportunity as well, right? And so it's hard to make the transition. So discussing on narrowly focusing in on the officer role will be time well spent. And if the officers have committees reporting up to them, I think that was one of the other things we heard about in chat is, how do I know what committees I'm responsible for? That should really be conveyed in there and discussed so that the officers understand what committees will be reporting up to them, dedicating time to talk through the communication flow from the committee up to that particular officer, and also emphasizing the importance of allowing that empowerment to flow to the committee and avoid attempts to intervene with or manage their particular work. And so we oftentimes have conversations about delegation because some of our officers are one-person shops, or they don't have folks that are reporting up to them. So that's kind of a delegation skill is something they're not used to. And so we want to spend time talking about what it means to delegate and not keep everything to themselves so that they become overwhelmed and feel like they have to do too much. If there's opportunities for officers to engage volunteers like episodically, encourage that. Be honest about the time commitment necessarily to execute properly their role of officer, and focus in on the discussion about engaging and delegating things that are outside of their specific role. So I think it's really healthy to have that conversation with them so that they have a good understanding about, you know, what do they have the ability to delegate and engage other volunteers in. And so let's consider the other expectations outside of what might exist in those specific roles. So this goes back to Donna's comment. Things such as protocols for requesting excused absences from board meetings or reviewing the code of conduct, right? Remember that each officer is a representative of the entire membership, and they have a duty to maintain that professionalism. Can we assume that everyone considers themselves a representative of the membership? Maybe not. So whatever is written and unwritten expectations are, dedicate time to discuss those and make sure that you have an open forum for people to ask about what is unwritten that's an expectation. Many times I find that our incoming officers are not well versed in facilitating a vote because they've not had to do that before. So we spend time talking through that process of who can initiate a vote, what happens if there's no second, what's the process for each step of the voting protocol. Talk about the process that your specific chapter bylaws allows for. Are you governed by Robert's Rules of Order? If so, talk through it. Ensure everyone has that foundational understanding of the governance protocols. I don't know, if they say they don't know, you know, that's the important thing about avoiding assumptions is they really truly may not know. And this is an opportunity. This is a great opportunity to help educate them so that they're prepared for success when they stand up at that podium and facilitate a vote, that they have the confidence to be able to do that. And creating that safe space to have that discussion is really key. So we're going to also talk about the NIGP required forms. And Jen, this is an excerpt from one of our past slide decks, so I'm not sure if these particular timeframes are still accurate or if we might need to update them before we do our next iteration. But this is another area that may be new to some and yet is critically important for all officers to be informed of and understand their role in ensuring that the forms are completed and submitted within the timeframes prescribed. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jen. Is there anything you want to talk about when it comes to this particular piece? What have you seen in the past? Have chapters struggled with understanding the timelines associated with these particular requirements?
Sure, thanks, Carrie. And I think what's important to note here, and it's something that really stood out to me this year, and I think the timing of this webinar is so critical this year, is that I really got a lot from new officers that said, I didn't know I had to turn in that form. So it goes to, again, to this question of this information being passed down. Who is in charge of putting the member data form? Is it the secretary? Is it the president? So it's outlining those roles. So then chapters feel bad. Oh my gosh, we didn't do it, but I didn't know who was supposed to do it. So having those kind of things in writing, those forms stay very consistent each year. That's not something that changes. So it is steadfast like that. So to put it into your boot camp. So your new officers coming in, there is no question that these forms are due. I think it was with Dallas, I think it was Julie even talked about as the treasurer position, especially set up your new treasurer for success by filling out the form or doing it with them for the first time, because maybe you've never seen an IRS 990 and be like, I don't know what to fill into any of these things. So those, again, I think are some of those unwritten expectations. You just say, do it. And then you look at it and have never had experience and are clueless to what it may be. So that mentoring of one coming and going when we talk about some of those things that are executed that may be brand new to somebody.
Absolutely. Great example. All right, so let's talk about post-event actions. Let's talk about what you might want to do after the event actually occurs. And again, we want to strike while the iron's hot. We want to be able to garner feedback and assess our effectiveness and be able to adjust appropriately for the next time. So we created a post-event checklist. One of the things is an acknowledgement of duties. This may not necessarily be required. We require it of our officers to affirm their understanding of the duties that they are going to be taking on. And we have a template of this for you that we'll be able to provide to you. I've created just a generic template. If that's something you're interested in implementing for your chapter, please feel free to use it. Issuing certificates of completion so that they actually have something to say they completed it. That's something, again, that just kind of goes a long way, and it's very easily prepared, and we've created a template for you as well for that. And think about doing a photo op there. Think about, having the officer stand up with your facilitator and taking a picture with their certificates or kind of in the room. Inform your membership that the session occurred, because that's really a great marketing opportunity. They likely will appreciate your investment in the officer's preparation for the successful year, and you never know. It might inspire some members to want to pursue an officer position in the future because they'll get to participate, right? So take those opportunities to take pictures. I know Ginny, she's a huge fan of taking pictures. She does such a great job at it. I've seen a lot of your chapters be posting things online and everything. So just really think about this opportunity to kind of capture those moments, even during the boot camp, because it's really great for your membership to know that you're investing time in the success of the officers. And you're going to want to solicit feedback from the participants so that you can kind of gauge the effectiveness. Did it accomplish what we as officers wanted to accomplish? Did it accomplish what the attendees wanted to accomplish? Did they get out of it what they thought they were going to get out of it? Or are there opportunities for feedback? Are there opportunities for us to make adjustments based on the feedback? So I've provided you with an example of some survey questions. Whoops. Let me go back to I'm going to go to the post-event documents here. These are just examples of the post-event documents. And again, I've got templates of these for you at the end, so we'll make sure that we provide those for you. They won't have our chapter logo on them. I've actually created them generically, so you can feel free to utilize these if you want to take advantage of those and implement those as well. It's just one less thing that you would have to work through to implement this program.
Carrie,
So let's talk about
Carrie, can you go back one? Because somebody brought up in chat earlier about buy-in, of getting your board and your new board to buy into their role, their duties and responsibilities. I think twofold. I think having this expectation when you go out for elections that this event will happen. I highly encourage you to do the officer acknowledgement of duties. I think there is something mental that happens when you put pen to paper and your name saying, I am agreeing to do X for this chapter. I also think it gives some validity if you have an officer or even a chair or a volunteer that's not doing their roles or responsibilities. We always say, well, what do your bylaws say if somebody's not attending enough meetings or whatever those things are, that this document helps in that. But I think there is something that happens of this commitment of signing to say, I agree to do X for the next year or two, that I think can be very, very powerful to implement.
Yeah, and we utilize this not just for the officers, but for any volunteers, for committees as well. So, kind of think bigger picture about that also. We do require that our committee volunteers sign this as well, just to affirm that they're aware of what their role and responsibility is. And we collect those annually. So feel free to utilize this if you think it's beneficial for your chapter. Post-event survey, simple questions like these. We don't want to make the survey too long because we want to, just kind of encourage them to participate and provide that feedback. So we do have some questions that I think help us in terms of the logistics, but also the relevance. How do you rate the training materials? Would you recommend any enhancements to those materials? Did the training help prepare you for success? As an officer, did you find it valuable? Was the time sufficient to cover the material? How would you rate the officer boot camp facilitator? So this is kind of thinking about, did we have effective facilitation? How would you rate the facility? So the location that you held it in, food, if you provided food, you might want to get a rating for that. Provide any suggestions to improve the boot camp and provide their overall thoughts. So a lot of these are just kind of fillable, free form to allow them to be able to provide their perspective. And I think it's really important to not just collect this information, but to also contemplate and do something with it. Because they are going to be the best people to be able to provide some feedback to help you enhance the program for in the future. And so I'll share with you that as a result of some of the feedback we've received, we have made adjustments on our program offering. We've added some additional detail. We've engaged in a lot more dialogue rather than just sharing information. We make sure that we have the opportunity for discussions, and we've added an extra time for them to bring up topics of their own and make sure that we're answering all those questions. So some of those adjustments were as a result of the feedback that we received. But the key really is to optimize to ensure that participants' expectations are being met. And so I'm going to pause here, Jen. I think we got a couple minutes left, so we're going to talk through any questions that you guys might have. This is your opportunity to ask questions, to learn. I really want to encourage you to consider doing a program of this nature. So if there's something maybe that I didn't touch on or that you want a deeper dive in, let's hear it.
I don't have any questions. So guys, if you want to raise your hand, take yourself off of mute. Please ask. This is the time to kind of pick Carrie's brain of, as she was explaining this and you had this moment of, oh, wonder if this would work. Did she do this? Now's that time to ask those questions. So if you have them, type them in or raise your hand. As you're doing that, these are the templates that Carrie specifically talked about. I'm going to post in the resource guide, like I said, at the top of the session, the slide deck, the recording, and the certificate of completion, acknowledgement form, and a task timeline. So we will put that on the website. Ginny, you've got a question. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. First of all, thank you, Carrie, for this great presentation. Super helpful. We're definitely going to think about changing the election process and doing it a lot earlier so that we can do this transition much smoother versus like, you're installed now, let's go. But I think my comment would be, and I think this is all complete, but my comment would be for you and Jen, if there's future sessions to this, like a 2.0 or something, could you guys give us like tips and tricks on going through like how to revisit the bylaws, revising them, and strategic plan, how to create them? Because I think we all struggle with that. We are getting through that now, but I'm assuming some other chapters are also something that they would want to revisit, and how often should we revisit it?
Ginny, I love that. And I think what I'm going to turn that into, and it did not happen this spring as I'd like, but I will do it in the fall, is having our leader calls by position, in which we can talk more in depth about your strategic planning. Actually, Zule is doing a session on strategic planning this fall for us. We can do one with the bylaws and what should be in bylaws versus what's in policy, as well as specific duties for maybe your treasurer and secretary. So my mind is on the same wavelength as you, Ginny. It's just we haven't put that together yet. But no, I love that idea, because what I'd like for it to happen is this fall, in this fall, late summer, to be a kickoff of all the chapters getting ready for that transition. So you think about putting this in place and having your elections. What does it take to redo your bylaws? What is it? We're getting ready to prepare our budget going into the new year. So that fall is spent kind of ramping up for those new people to take over. Maybe it is the same people, but you're due for a strategic plan, or you are due for putting a new budget in place. So love that idea, but very much on the wavelength as you. Barbara asked about where you're going to find this. Barbara, I'm going to do it in Leaders in the Loop, but it's actually going to be under the governance section of the resources. So on our website, under chapters, you'll see the chapter resource guide, and then under governance, we'll actually have a whole section that's going to be called Officer Bootcamp in Transition, in which we'll have an image of her slide deck, the recording, and then these templates there. But I will link it in Leaders in the Loop next week to the exact location for you. Any other questions? If not, we're gonna do one other poll here. And this is now, how likely are you to implement a structured leadership onboarding after having Carrie really outline this for you all?
All right, so we're getting some
Appreciate the honesty. I knew that there would be, that like this, but not ready yet. This may, not be this fall for chapters. This may not be, let's dive in right now. It may take a year to implement something like that. And I think it's okay. I think it's just getting you all the tools that you need and the mindset to start having those conversations as a board, of making this a little bit more formal. Because I think, to Jenny's point, I think a lot of times, because of work, life, it is, you get sworn in, you are elections happen, you're sworn in, and then here you go do. And I think this piece gets overlooked a lot. And I think the importance is setting up your new officers for success. And I think that's really so important. I think several of the things Carrie talked about, of showing the excitement about this buy-in, may help with recruitment and succession for future plans. That, who wants to volunteer when you don't know if you'll be successful, you don't really know what you're to do or what's expected. And this may help with that recruitment when you have a hard time finding people to volunteer or to step up. So I think this could be a really strong piece for that long-term succession and leadership planning.
Yeah, I was going to say that too, Jen. I feel like it will be a good recruitment for people. We're always looking for good volunteers for our chapter, and some people might just be reluctant, but this could be the thing that puts them over the edge. If you're marketing and showing, that you've been successful doing this and that people are getting something out of it, that might make the difference between somebody stepping forward and saying, you know what, I'm going to step up because I know that there's a level of support that's going to help me be successful.
And Rick, I love that you were very honest about, getting your current leadership to buy into this. And I think this will take some time for some chapters. If it's not something you all are used to, or think that is necessary, it might be hard. But I think Carrie mentioned it a couple times. It's about messaging. It's about how you bring it to them, and the importance of, this is not a gotcha or tell you what to do. This is setting you up for success to do your job effectively as the leader of this chapter. So some of it may just be how you bring it to them. And again, I think we all are aware this first time of putting together is going to be the hardest. That's going to be where the most work comes in, and why it may take a year and why it takes a team, but will be so much easier in following years, because then you're just making tweaks and just doing updates. So.
Yeah. And I would say, start small, but start.
Yep.
Just start small, but at least start. Like, even if you do a component of it and build on it, like we did over multiple years, that's okay too. At least you're setting some foundation, and you can build on it in future years too.
Well, Carrie, thank you very much for leading us through this today. I think this was extremely helpful of kind of outlining kind of the concept from beginning to end. And I think that was very helpful. I think that's the hardest thing sometimes is just how do I start this? I can't wrap my hands around it at all. So thank you for your time today. Everybody, we will get this posted. Keep questions coming. I can get to Carrie if you want to have any very specific questions that Carrie may have. If you have questions that I may be able to help you with, or some ideas, or maybe even things that you have in place that your chapter can share with us if you're doing programs already. We'll put that all up online. But thank you guys very much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody. Good luck. Can't wait to hear from you when you implement.
Yep.
Thanks,
Thank
Carrie.
you.
Thank you.
Yeah, forum. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.